Howard, thank you very much for your kind introduction. I'd like to express my deepest appreciation to the Center for Refugee Studies for affording me this opportunity. I'm particularly pleased that my dear mother was able to join us today. She is the heroine of the story I'm about to tell, and she's doing just fine at 91. I have neither an academic background in refugee studies nor experience working with refugees. When I was a university student some 4 decades ago, as Howard has mentioned, my primary field of study was philosophy, specifically modern German philosophy. Since then, I have been immersed in the world of real estate development and property management, fields that are very far removed from today's subject. It is, however, a fact that I began my life 63 years ago in a refugee camp in northern Italy, remaining stateless until I was granted Canadian citizenship together with my refugee parents at the age of 6. Over the years, this detail concerning my origins has had an ever-growing impact on my consciousness. It led me ultimately to write the book which Howard mentioned about the travails of my dispossessed and traumatized parents and the astonishing process of healing and reconciliation they underwent along the way to building a successful new life in Canada. The presentation that follows is the work of a highly interested and emotionally vested amateur whose understanding of the refugee experience is far more visceral than scholarly. I am honored that you have seen fit to invite me here today, despite my obvious shortcomings, and I beg your indulgence in sparing me the rigorous scrutiny to which you might subject your academic peers delivering a lecture on this topic. You will find out within the next hour or so whether or not it was a good idea to invite me. At the outset, it is important to note that the massive refugee problem burdening Europe at the end of the Second World War was the direct consequence of German wartime actions. But in the specific case of Jewish refugees, there quite simply would not have been any were it up to the Germans. Had the war carried on longer than it did, God forbid, they might have achieved their goal of eliminating every single Jew in Europe before moving on to those living in the rest of the world. Thus, most of the European Jews fated to undergo the horrors of refugeehood had already endured the far more severe horrors of surviving the Holocaust. During the course of the Second World War, the Germans deported between 7 and 9 million Europeans from their home countries. While the war was still raging, the Allied powers already anticipated that a huge refugee crisis would follow the defeat of Nazi Germany. Accordingly, they began drafting plans as early as 1943 to meet the challenge of liberating, rehabilitating, and repatriating the millions of refugees who would come under their control. The colossal relief effort was expected to take no longer than 6 months. Shortly after Germany's surrender in May 1945, the Allied occupation forces, along with civilian rescue teams, began the successful repatriation of more than 6 million refugees. And this mission was essentially accomplished by December 1945. But they were ill-prepared to handle the remaining 1 million or so refugees, mostly from Eastern Europe. Among this number were a great many Jews who had survived concentration camps and forced labor camps or had been in hiding. These people refused to return to the lands where their families had been massacred and their communities destroyed, and where anti-Semitism was still rampant. 150,000 Polish Jewish survivors who had been repatriated from the Soviet Union fled Poland after the notorious pogrom in Kielce on July 4, 1946, which claimed the lives of 42 Jews, all of them survivors of the camps. Widespread anti-Jewish violence in southern Poland convinced many survivors that they could not return to their pre-war homes, and this led to a significant second movement of Jewish refugees from Poland to the West. By mid-1947, the total number of Jewish refugees from various Eastern and Central European countries who had found their way to the liberated territories of Germany, Austria, and Italy reached 250,000. The enormous challenge of dealing with all these refugees was taken up by the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, commonly known by its acronym UNRWA, UNRRA, not to be confused with UNRWA, which still exists. This organization had been created in 1943, 2 years before the United Nations itself, in anticipation of the inevitable humanitarian crisis following the end of the war. Its two major functions were relief activities in the liberated countries and caring for displaced persons in camps set up for this purpose. In 1946, the United Nations created the International Refugee Organization, the IRO, as a specialized agency to assist in the repatriation, protection, and resettlement of refugees and stateless persons. The responsibilities initially assigned to UNRWA were transferred to the IRO, which continued its work until it was dissolved in 1952. Some of its functions were taken over by governments and voluntary agencies, and others were handed over to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. The term displaced persons suggested that the people in question had been nudged out of their old homes in as neutral a fashion as the water had been nudged out of Archimedes' famous bathtub. In reality, they were refugees, in accordance with the simple dictionary definition of a refugee as, quote, one who leaves one's native land either because of expulsion or to escape persecution, end quote. The so-called displaced persons camps were optimistically intended to provide a short-term housing solution for the refugees until they could be resettled elsewhere. In practice, many of the camps became longer-term domiciles for Jews who refused to return to their native lands because of bad memories or rampant anti-Semitism, but were unable to emigrate to either Palestine or the United States, their two preferred options, because of stringent immigration restrictions. It is interesting to note the fact that the camps were established in, of all places, Germany, Austria, and Italy, giving the impression of retribution inflicted by the victors upon the vanquished. those who had caused the war leading to the problem of the refugees could now squirm at having these wretched people deposited in their very midst. The message was driven home most appallingly by those UNRWA facilities which were established on the grounds of former concentration camps, without regard to the sensitivities of those who had just been liberated from those hellish places. Particularly jarring was the large camp established on the site of the notorious former concentration camp of Bergen-Belsen in Germany. Most of the Jewish refugees ended up in the British occupation zone in northern Germany and in the American occupation zone in the south. Several large camps holding 4,000 to 6,000 people each were located in the American zone. My focus today, however, will be on one particular camp in the British occupation zone in northern Italy, the unimaginatively named UNRWA Camp Number 17 in Grugliasco. The reason for this focus is quite simple. My own parents and other family members who fled their homes in Hungary after the war lived in this particular camp for 2.5 years, from April 1946 to September 1948. And I happen to have been born there in March 1948. I have made an effort over the years to learn about the inauspicious place where I started my life and what transpired there. Although there were surely differences among the various UNRWA camps, they all had certain characteristics in common. Before proceeding to a description of the organization of the Grugliasco Displaced Persons Camp and the day-to-day life of the residents, I would like to outline briefly the background of my parents and the circumstances which led to their being trapped in this particular camp. In its broad contours, I believe their experience mirrors that of a great many other Jewish Holocaust survivors/refugees in the years following the end of the Second World War. My father, Bela Rubinstein, was living with his wife and 2 young sons in the village of Szentistván, Hungary, where he owned and operated a flour mill. Early in the war, he was shipped by the anti-Semitic Nazi collaborationist government to a Munkatábor, a forced labor camp, as were a great many other able-bodied Hungarian Jewish men. In the spring of 1944, while he was thus involuntarily far from home, his wife and children, and most of his extended family, were rounded up by the Germans, who had by then seized direct control of Hungary and confined together with all the other Jews of the district in a so-called ghetto. From there, they were transported to the Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland, where almost all were gassed to death. Parents, grandparents, siblings, uncles, aunts, and cousins. When he returned home at the end of the war and learned that he no longer had a family, and that, moreover, the new communist government was about to nationalize his flour mill, which was all that he had left in the world, my father came to the melancholy but unavoidable conclusion that there was no future for him in Hungary. He was also deeply shaken by the bitter realization that the best of his non-Jewish neighbors, that is, those who did not actively cooperate with the Nazis in ferreting out every last Jew for deportation, did not so much as lift a finger to help the people who had dwelt amicably in their midst for generations. Compared with Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, and other countries with the deeply rooted traditions of hating and persecuting Jews. Hungary had been an enlightened beacon of opportunity and acceptance for its Jewish inhabitants. Hungarian Jews expressed their deep gratitude by being the most loyal of patriots, who made outstanding contributions to society in virtually every field of endeavor, out of all proportion to their numbers in the population. Blinded by their unconditional love for the fatherland, the Jews of Hungary were in total denial about their sudden reversal of fortune, and thus utterly unprepared for the calamities that followed. When bitter disillusionment finally struck them, far too late, it struck extremely hard. My mother, Judith Schwarz, was similarly rounded up with her parents and brothers and all the other Jewish residents of Serenc, an industrial town in eastern Hungary, and shipped by train to Auschwitz. She survived this horrific experience by staying healthy and working hard, thus proving useful to the Nazis. Judith and one of her brothers, who managed to jump off the train and escape to Budapest, were the only members of their family to remain alive. When they returned to Serenc after the war, they were greeted with extreme hostility by the former neighbors who had occupied the family home and plundered their possessions. They were not allowed to proceed past the front door, and they were threatened with dire consequences if they made any trouble. It was impossible for my orphaned mother and uncle to remain in such a place. They left town as they had arrived, with nothing but the clothes they were wearing, and a firm resolve to never again set foot in that accursed town. Bela and Judith met through mutual acquaintances and decided to marry at the earliest opportunity. But their first priority was to get out of Hungary, as they had heard through the grapevine that the communists were preparing not only to confiscate all private property, but to seal the borders to prevent emigration. Together with a group of 7 relatives who had also survived the camps, they crossed the border illegally into Yugoslavia, thus sealing their status as refugees. They had absolutely no idea where to go from that point forward. Looking back at that era, it is shocking to realize that after the death camps had been liberated, and no one could any longer plead ignorance regarding the tragic fate of 6 million European Jews, not one country in the world was willing to take in the dispossessed survivors out of purely humanitarian motives. The historic Jewish homeland in British Mandatory Palestine, the preferred choice of my parents and many other Jewish refugees, was not an option, as the British had cast their lot with the Arabs by blockading the Mediterranean coast. The refugees' other preferred destination, the United States, had a hopelessly inadequate annual quota for Jewish immigrants. As for Canada, the blatantly discriminatory government of the day did not want to absorb any number of Jews under any circumstances. I shall have more to say on this subject later on. In the absence of an alternative, my family eventually drifted into northern Italy, together with many thousands of other Jews with nowhere to go. Finding their way to the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration Processing Center in Milano, they were officially registered as displaced persons and in April 1946, they were directed to proceed to the displaced persons camp in Grugliasco, just outside Torino in northwestern Italy, which was administered by the British Army on behalf of UNRWA. UNRWA Camp Number 17 held about 3,000 people at any given time. It had been established shortly before my parents' arrival on the grounds of the Istituto Interprovinciale per Inferma di Mente. Please pardon my Italian pronunciation. This translates as the Interprovincial Institute for the Infirm of Mind, which had originally housed an all-female psychiatric hospital. Early in the war, the Italian army had requisitioned the residential quarters of the Grugliasco Psychiatric Hospital for the billeting of troops stationed in the area. All of the patients were relocated to other hospitals in the north of Italy. An order of nuns originally assigned to care for the patients maintained a convent in the building at the entrance to the campus. Upon the collapse of Mussolini's government and the German seizure of Italy to prevent its army from defecting to the Allies, members of the Wehrmacht replaced the Italian soldiers in the Grugliasco dormitories. The end of the war brought British military occupation to the northern part of Italy. The hospital campus was first handed to the British Red Cross and then eventually to UNRWA. The buildings no doubt functioned quite well when utilized for their originally intended purpose. However, they did not stand up to the extraordinary demands now being made on them. The camp's population far exceeded the numbers the buildings were designed to accommodate. Bedrooms meant for 4 psychiatric patients of the same gender now housed 7 married couples. Some residents tried to improvise privacy partitions out of the flimsy camp-issued blankets, but to little avail. Since there were no storage facilities in the rooms, residents had to keep their personal belongings stowed in bags beneath their beds. The hopelessly inadequate toilet and shower facilities were clustered at either end of the long, narrow hallways. They had intentionally been built without partitions so that the staff could keep the all-female psychiatric patients under constant surveillance. As people had to sleep together and go to the bathroom together, it is not surprising that they had to eat together as well. Each dormitory room was furnished with a long wooden table with benches on either side. At mealtimes, residents picked up their food from the central kitchen and brought it back to their rooms. The lack of personal space made people extremely irritable. In addition, there was not nearly enough activity in the camp to keep people happy. The combination of lack of privacy and long-term idleness resulted in a very high level of frustration. Residents whose nerves were already frayed by their wartime ordeals bickered and argued with one another at the slightest provocation. Married couples in Grugliasco had a strong incentive to start a family. Those fortunate enough to have children were assigned to one of the special smaller rooms, which had previously held dangerous psychiatric patients in solitary confinement. They did not have more personal space in these claustrophobic quarters than in the wards, but they did have precious solitude. The only others to receive private accommodations were the handful of residents known to have served as kapos, privileged prisoners who had been put in charge of other Jewish prisoners in the concentration camps. These ruthless and conniving people had always managed to obtain the best of everything for themselves at the expense of others. They were able to ingratiate themselves with the British administrators of the camp and gain special consideration, just as they had done with the German administrators of the concentration camps. There were some Jews living in Gruliasko under false pretenses. These people never endured the hell of the concentration camps, but arranged to have numbers tattooed on their forearms after the war. They did this, incredibly, in order to qualify for the special benefits from the Red Cross and other aid agencies available to camp survivors. The Eastern European Jews comprising the majority of Gruliasko residents, who conversed among themselves in Yiddish, tended to have little use for those who did not, generally treating them with scornful contempt and regarding them as having gotten off easily during the war due to the comparatively late occupation of such countries as Hungary and Czechoslovakia by the Germans. There was little evidence in the camp of either sickness or mortality. Those who had survived the war, after all, were the young and strong. The camp had a well-equipped infirmary staffed by a full-time English doctor. But there was little activity there. In the rare case of a serious medical condition, the patient would be transferred to a proper hospital in Torino. In the still less common instance of a patient dying in the hospital, funeral arrangements were made by the Torino Jewish community, and burial took place in the city's Jewish cemetery. Aside from the deceased's family, no one was interested in knowing about such occurrences, much less in traveling from Gruliasko for a funeral. The residents of the camp had all experienced quite enough of death. For the sake of facilitating their psychic healing, they chose to ignore this particular unpleasant aspect of life. Each day, UNRWA workers provided the camp residents with food rations. These were decidedly unappetizing and lacking in variety and balance. The dietary staple, as might have been expected in Italy, was pasta. The high carbohydrate diet also contained a great deal of nutritionally deficient American-style white bread. Once a day, the residents were served some kind of poor-quality meat. The authorities also distributed a daily ration of unfiltered cigarettes to each resident, evidently regarding these as a basic human necessity. Fresh fruits and vegetables were simply not part of the camp diet. As a result, many people suffered from scurvy. In addition, the scarcity of dairy products resulted in calcium deficiencies. The poor diet had a particularly adverse impact on people who had arrived in Gruliasko already debilitated by years of malnutrition. Still, as much as they complained about the food, most residents were able to keep things in perspective. They appreciated the fact that well-intentioned strangers were taking the trouble to feed them, even if their hardened circumstances prevented them, at times, from expressing their appreciation appropriately. Once the refugees came to rest in Gruliasko, all thoughts turned to marriage. Indeed, it would seem that marriages were the primary social activity in the camp. The lack of opportunity to marry during the war had resulted in a huge pent-up demand, which was released in an enormous burst of matrimonial energy once life began returning to normal. Aside from the universal human impulses, for people whose families had been destroyed, there was a special urgency and a sublime significance to this normally prosaic activity, as well as a sense of triumphal defiance. Practically every married woman in the camp, capable of bearing a child, was either pregnant or a new mother. There was a strong desire to make up for lost time. During the war, hardly any Jewish children were born, and amongst those who had been born, there was a very slight chance of survival. The best antidote to the profound demoralization afflicting the survivors was to bring as many Jewish children as possible into the world. In the years following the end of the Second World War, Italy was economically devastated. There was not nearly enough work for the Italians, let alone for the refugees in their midst. It was made clear to the residents of the Grugliasco camp that all their basic needs would be met, but they were forbidden to seek any kind of employment outside the camp. Those who had an entrepreneurial background and a strong work ethic were frustrated and humiliated to be sitting around day after day with nothing to do. The Organization for Rehabilitation Training, commonly known as the ORT, with support from the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, popularly known as the Joint, was active in Grugliasco, as it was in many other refugee camps. ORT established workshops that taught metalworking, woodworking, and leather tanning to the men, and dressmaking and knitting to the women. All the machinery, materials, and manuals came from headquarters in Switzerland. When ORT officials learned that my mother was an experienced dressmaker, they offered her a job as an instructor in the design and sewing of dresses. She was assigned 39 students who were happy to be learning a trade and grateful for an activity to fill their empty days. My mother, in turn, was happy to be doing something productive, and she certainly appreciated the modest ORT salary. My mother was eventually promoted to the position of vice president of the Grugliasco chapter. Her new job consisted of visiting women in the camp who had recently given birth and advising them on how to care for their babies. These women did not have mothers of their own to guide them, and they tended to be overprotective because of their own vulnerable pasts. My mother continued working for ORT until she was ready to give birth to her own child. In addition to supporting the activities of ORT, the Joint was active in Grugliasco in its own right. Every year before Rosh Hashanah, in accordance with tradition, it delivered a bag of almonds and raisins to each family. Everyone appreciated this small but thoughtful gesture. However, what really made a practical difference in the lives of people in the camp were the huge bales of used clothing that arrived periodically from the United States. Particularly prized were baby liettes and winter clothes. Camp residents were touched to realize that total strangers in distant America evidently cared about them and went to the trouble of helping them. The authorities made a conscientious effort to provide for Jewish religious needs. A synagogue was established and equipped with a brand new Torah scroll and prayer books. But the well-meaning Englishmen running the camp simply did not comprehend the fury of these people against the God who had abandoned them at the moment of their most desperate need. Hardly anyone attended the prayer services. On those festival days when the traditional Yizkor prayer was recited in memory of loved ones, virtually everyone showed up at the synagogue, but only for the brief memorial portion of the service. A torrent of emotions rushed forth, a wail of lamentation engulfing the camp as the all-too-raw recent tragedy of the Jewish people was recalled. Then, emotionally exhausted and embarrassed by their unseemly display of vulnerability, the residents stumbled out of the synagogue and back to their nihilistic despair. Hardly anyone in the camp was interested in the lectures and classes on Judaism arranged by the administrators. On the other hand, the old Hollywood films screened every Thursday night always drew a full house. Zionist movements representing the entire spectrum from revisionist to labor and from religious to atheist invested great efforts in reaching out to the Jewish refugees in Guliasko, regarding them quite naturally as prospective citizens of the nascent Jewish state, although they worked together toward the common goal of convincing people to go to Eretz Yisrael. The various movements also competed vigorously amongst themselves to attract recruits. The debates got quite heated at times and took on the character of a spectator sport. Fans would crowd around to cheer their team, grateful for the spirited alleviation of boredom. By and large, these were embittered, demoralized, cynical people, deeply scarred by the horrors they had endured. Very few things had the capacity to inspire them. Zionism, however, had a special resonance for those who had suffered the tragic consequences of Jewish powerlessness. They tingled with excitement at the prospect of Jews finally taking control of their destiny in their own state. The basic human need of the Gruliasko residents for shelter and sustenance was quite well met, but it was far easier to heal the body than it was to heal the spirit. Everyone in the camp had suffered the loss of loved ones, parents, grandparents, siblings, at the hands of the Nazi murderers. But my father also had to deal with the severe trauma and irrational guilt of having his first wife and 2 young sons torn from their home and shipped to Auschwitz, never to return, while he was far away and helpless in a Hungarian forced labor camp. In the early days after arriving at Gruliasko, my father was detached and distant. For long hours, he would lie on his bed in the dormitory, staring blankly at the ceiling. Everyone left him alone, understanding that he had still not made his peace with the loss of his family. It would be some time yet before he was interested in doing anything other than mourn his tragic loss. The residents of UNRWA Camp Number 17 experienced many acts of kindness by ordinary Italians. They came to regard these gestures as vital to the gradual restoration of their faith in humanity. Manifestations of decency were not limited to the local Italian populace. To this day, my mother retains strong memories of Miss Hayward, a native of Manchester, who served as the personal assistant to Captain Davidge, the British administrator of the Grugliasco camp. Miss Hayward was an exceptionally kind and compassionate individual. Horrified to learn of the barbarous atrocities committed against the Jews of Europe, she dedicated herself to atoning for the collective sins of the civilized world by tending as best she could to the needs of the surviving remnant. Little by little, the suffocating darkness of the war years began to dissipate. It remained an incontrovertible fact that there were many evil people in the world. But day by day, it grew ever more apparent that there were plenty of good people as well. The spiritual lift provided by periodic encounters with members of the latter category gave the survivors reason to hope for a better future. The war may have been over, but its aftershocks bedeviled many of the emotionally fragile residents of Grugliasco for a long time to come. The camp was brimming with heart-rending tragedies. Characteristic was the story of Eva, one of the women who worked with my mother as a sewing instructor. She had heard through the Majdanek grapevine that her husband, Marek, her first and true love, was seen being led to the gas chamber. In her desperate loneliness and her craving to return to a normal life, she hastily married Bero, a fellow refugee. He was much older than she, and they had almost nothing in common. She bore 2 children by her new husband. One day, Marek showed up in Grugliasco, having somehow miraculously survived the gas chamber. Eva was exultant. Without hesitation, she abandoned Beryl and her 2 children and left the camp with Marek. Alas, Marek was no longer the person she had known and loved. His heart-harrowing concentration camp experiences had thoroughly brutalized him, rendering him manic-depressive and abusive. In truth, Eva was not the same person she had been 6 years earlier either. Within 2 weeks, she was back in Grugliasco with her new family. Certain residents of the camp proved unable to leave the less savory aspects of their wartime experiences behind them, and so managed to draw the enmity of the others. An example was Mr. Lobo, who had been assigned the job of camp postmaster. Every day, he sorted the incoming mail and distributed it to the addressees. It was common practice for relatives in other countries to send small amounts of money by mail to people in the camp. However, the envelopes were frequently delivered with obvious signs of tampering. When it became known that Lobo was helping himself to the money, some people were so incensed that they grabbed the thief and roughed him up. Soon after, Lobo and his wife disappeared from the camp. Other residents would be caught red-handed stealing food rations from their fellows. They would grin nervously and offer the excuse that they were hungry. Still others broke into the general supply warehouse and appropriated things for themselves, using the concentration camp euphemism, organisieren, scraping together to rationalize their theft. They could not grasp the moral distinction between outwitting the Nazis in order to survive and cheating their fellow Jews now that danger had passed. The self-obsessed behavior that had enabled them to endure the death camps was so deeply ingrained in their personalities that they were now enslaved by it. The memory of concentration camps and forced labor camps was still vivid in the minds of the people in Gruliasko. To expect them to behave in a courteous and considerate manner so soon after the war would have been unreasonable and perhaps even cruel. The exceptions to such behavior were remarkable. Life in Gruliasko was anything but normal. However, it was a huge improvement over what all of the residents had just recently left behind them. They were not really free, but they were no longer enslaved. A curfew was in effect, and everyone was expected to be within the walls of the camp between 8 p.m. and 7 a.m. During the day, everyone was at liberty to do as they pleased, as long as they did not seek work. No one ever asked the residents where they were going or what they were doing. True, it was degrading for them not to be able to support themselves, but their basic need for shelter and sustenance was satisfied, and there were no enemies threatening their very existence. These were things that no survivor of the wartime camps could ever take for granted. Ever so gradually, the residents of Gruliasko began to reassemble the shattered pieces of their lives, cultivating the commonplace aspirations of people everywhere. They dreamt of establishing households and raising children, of working with dignity and taking the occasional family trip. My father joked with the others that one day they would at last be settled somewhere, working hard for a living. They would look back with nostalgia to the carefree time in Gruliasko when they were on a perpetual vacation. My mother has often remarked that she is not sure how well the members of the group would have managed had they been given the opportunity to return to living a normal life right away. At the time, all they could think about was how irritated they were to be trapped in such a dreadful place after the torments they had just recently endured. In retrospect, it proved a great blessing that the survivors were granted this transitional breathing space before having to readjust to life on the outside. So what happened finally to all the Jews living in refugee camps, such as the one in Gruliasko? There were as many different stories as there were individuals in the camps, but they all had one thing in common. All the refugees were eventually resettled, generally with great success. My parents' particular story, which I am about to relate, is, I believe, quite representative in its essentials. Judging by the historical record, Canada seemed a rather implausible haven for homeless Jews. In 1938, 32 nations, including Canada, had attended the Evian Conference to discuss the problem of Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany. All of them decided to refuse further Jewish immigration. In 1939, the SS St. Louis, packed with German Jewish refugees, was denied sanctuary in Canada after being refused entry to Cuba and the United States and forced to return to Europe. During the war, the leadership of the Canadian Jewish community tried desperately to convince the government to admit Jewish refugees beyond the very restrictive quota then in place. Throughout this period, Canada let in only about 5,000 Jews, one of the worst records of any of the refugee-receiving countries. The basis of Canada's post-war immigration policy was contained in a statement issued by Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King in May 1947. He declared that Canada would participate in the rescue and resettlement of displaced persons from the European camps. At the same time, he laid out the views of the government with regard to longer-term immigration policy. Immigrants would be selected carefully because admission to Canada was a privilege, not a right. The number of immigrants to be admitted would relate to the absorptive capacity of the country. Since absorptive capacity varies from year to year depending on economic conditions, the number of immigrants admitted in a given year would also vary. What remained unstated by Mackenzie King was that in the government's view, Jews were undesirables who would strain the absorptive capacity of the country in any year. Thus, although it was clearly in the national interest to increase the population, it was also considered to be in the national interest to limit the number of Jewish immigrants to the bare minimum. Today, we Canadians cherish our well-earned image as a humane and compassionate nation. It is a sad historical reality, however, that as late as 1948, the Government of Canada did not want to absorb Jewish immigrants. Frederick Charles Blair, Director of the Immigration Branch, faithfully enforced this policy. He warned that unless safeguards were put in place, there was a danger of Canada being, quote, flooded with Jewish people, unquote. He made no secret of his personal dislike for Jews, and he was very proud of his strong record in keeping them out of Canada. When asked by a delegation of Jewish community leaders how many Jews he would be prepared to see enter the country, an unidentified senior immigration official issued the infamous response that none is too many. The leaders of the Jewish community concluded that the only way to get significant numbers of Jewish refugees into Canada was to demonstrate that they had something of value to contribute. The garment industry, for example, was a mainstay of the Canadian economy, but its growth was hampered by a chronic shortage of workers. As it happened, this industry was heavily represented by Jews at all levels, from business owners to union officials and workers. For once, they overcame their customary adversarial relationship in order to help their unfortunate brethren trapped in Europe. The Canadian Overseas Garment Commission, a partnership between the Canadian Jewish Congress and the Canadian Garment Workers Union, was established to bring skilled tailors to Canada from the refugee camps. The Canadian Overseas Fur Commission followed soon afterwards. The politicians regarded the intensive lobbying in Ottawa as evidence of the well-known Jewish trait of pushiness. But in the end, it paid off. In October 1947, approval was granted for the admission of 2,136 tailors and 500 furriers. There was no specific mention of Jews in the Ordering Council. From the government's point of view, this was to be a strictly pragmatic, economically motivated immigration. An 8-man delegation headed by Canadian Fur Workers Union officials Harris Silver and Max Fetterman came to Rome in June 1948 to recruit Jews from the various Italian refugee camps. My father's older brother, Armin, worked in the office of Captain Davidge, the British military administrator of the Guglielmo camp. Just before the arrival of the Canadians, Armin's boss informed him of this initiative, and he immediately told his family. Interviews were to be held on a first-come, first-served basis beginning Sunday, June 13th. When my father and the other 4 men in the family arrived at the appointed place in Rome, a long queue of aspiring furriers had already formed. They did manage, however, to be among those fortunate enough to be granted interviews. None of them had any experience working with furs, nor did the great majority of those standing in line with them. The Jewish officials from Canada had no difficulty figuring this out, but they did not care. Whatever the views of their government, they were on a humanitarian mission to bring as many dispossessed Jews as possible to a better life in Canada. My father and his younger brother, as well as one of his nephews, were accepted. Armin was rejected because at 56 he was deemed too old to be of any benefit to Canada. The other nephew was also turned down because he failed the medical examination on account of scars left on a lung by a long-forgotten childhood illness. By the following day, word of the interviews had spread through all the Italian camps, and a mob of Jewish refugees desperate to become Canadians descended upon Rome. Alas, the delegation's meager quota had already been filled the day before. Many latecomers were highly resentful. Believing that, as usual, his money would get him whatever he wanted, one of the Grugliasco black marketers offered $5,000 in cash to any accepted applicant who was willing to switch identities. There were no takers. The delighted new furriers were oblivious to the intrigue that had raged behind the scenes in faraway Ottawa. After much wheeling and dealing, the delegation was authorized to fill the 500-person furrier quota with 300 Jews and 200 non-Jews. The Canadian authorities regarded this ratio as a grand concession to the pushy Jews. They had at first insisted on an equal balance between Jews and non-Jews because they did not want Jews jumping the immigration queue. In the end, they grudgingly conceded that the split was not realistic, given the enormity of the Jewish refugee problem in Europe. Sure enough, finding the Jews was easy, but only 59 displaced non-Jews interested in going to Canada as furriers could be identified by the delegation. After all, non-Jews were welcome in Canada and had no end of employment opportunities. The displeased Canadian authorities abruptly halted the entire program. The delegation, they complained, had not kept its end of the bargain by adhering to the agreed-upon ratio. Harry Rubin and Joe Kerbel, representing the fur industry, met in Ottawa with the Deputy Minister of Labour and the Director of Immigration, and they were informed that no Jewish furriers would come to Canada until the quota of 200 non-Jews was filled. At long last, the government authorized the recruitment of 141 inexperienced, non-Jewish single females between the ages of 18 and 25, who would come as apprentices to the fur industry. A number of people questioned the wisdom of agreeing to what was, in effect, a numerus clausus with regard to Jewish immigration into Canada. There was also a certain uneasiness that some of the non-Jewish individuals coming to Canada might have been involved in war crimes against Jews. The leaders consoled themselves with the thought that while the 141 non-Jewish women were coming as individuals, the 300 Jewish men were coming with their families, for an actual total closer to 800 Jews redeemed from the refugee camps. And I'm almost done. I'll cut a bit. The three men in my family who had been accepted as fur workers sailed from Genoa to Halifax with their wives and babies and settled in Toronto. The men were assigned to various fur shops where they quickly learned the fur trade and the women found work in dress factories. The moment the men had completed a full year of employment as fur workers, fulfilling the key condition of their acceptance as immigrants in Canada, they opened their own fur shop, undeterred by their limited work experience, lack of English proficiency, and dearth of investment capital. Just 3 years later, they started building houses, concerning which they knew even less than they did about sewing fur coats. They were doggedly determined to rebuild their shattered lives in the new country, and they were prepared to work as long and hard as necessary to achieve this objective. In time, they succeeded in building up a large and reputable real estate development company. It is a source of immense satisfaction to the refugee child within me that not only have the members of my family totally refuted the initial misgivings of the Canadian government about accepting Jewish refugees as immigrants. They have expressed their appreciation and repaid their debt to Canada many times over through their substantial contribution to the economy, creating many jobs and placing roofs over a great many heads. I have described briefly the life of one particular Jewish refugee family, my own, in one particular refugee camp in northern Italy during the period of 1946 to 1948, as well as the family's experience of immigrating to Canada in 1948 to build a better life. I have, of course, told the story that I know best, the one that resonates deeply within me. But although the details laid out here may be specific to certain individuals, I do believe strongly that the broad outlines of the story apply to a great many other people of diverse origins who have experienced being refugees at various times and places. People who find themselves uprooted from their homes and endangered, ending up trapped in refugee camps until given an opportunity to build new lives in a new country, generally do not take such good fortune for granted. By and large, they express their gratitude by working hard, respecting the law, and raising children with strong values. The Canada of today is, thank goodness, a very far cry from the bigoted and mean-spirited Canada of 1948. We are justifiably proud of the fact that this country now has one of the most enlightened immigration policies in the world, providing equal opportunity to people of all races, creeds, and lands of origin. Canada today leads by moral example in absorbing refugees just because this is the decent, compassionate thing to do. The ultimately positive immigrant experience of my own refugee family confirms that, in the end, this country has been amply rewarded for its benevolence with productive and loyal citizens who contribute far more to their adoptive country than they draw from it. Allow me to conclude by returning for a moment to the thousands of hapless, dispossessed Jews languishing in refugee camps in Germany, Italy, and Austria. None of these people had wanted to be refugees, and they chafed under the indignity of it all. Their most ardent wish was to return to being normal, settled people living normal lives as soon as possible. With the passage of the 1948 and 1950 Displaced Persons Acts and the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, the remaining refugees left en masse and settled predominantly in the United States, 330,000 people, Australia, 182,000 people, and Israel, 132,000 people. By 1952, there were virtually no Jewish refugees remaining in Europe, and the camps were closed down. Thank you very much.